Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this session, this event called Surveillance on the Sea. I am so happy all of you are here today. There are QR codes that are scattered throughout the room. You can register for the event if you would like a recording, perhaps to share with your courses, or maybe if this is something for those of you students in the crowd who are really interested in surveillance and privacy, then you can refer to this in the future if you're doing any sort of research projects or something of that sort. There are also accessibility materials around the room. So for my talk, there are the access to the slides, as well as a transcript of what I'm saying, so that way you can follow along if you'd like. Okay. So to introduce myself, because I'm sure some of you are not familiar with me on campus yet, I was just hired this past fall. So it's my second semester here. My name is Dr. Morgan Banville. I'm an assistant professor of humanities here at UMass Maritime. And if we haven't met before, my research and teaching interests really focus on the intersection of technical communication and surveillance studies. So I'll overview the sort of exigency and beginnings of why we're all here today for this event. And I'll also introduce our guest speaker as well. Perhaps it might be easier if I stand over here. Change these slides, huh? Okay, so if you have not already, please scan this QR code again to register for the event. It's going to help with me tracking the in-person attendees, and you'll also receive a follow-up email when a recording becomes available. There's a tiny URL listed as well. If you cannot scan, you can just access that via web. And again, there are QR codes for the documents around the room. As a coalition of scholars invested in social justice, anti-racism, and accessibility, it is important to us that all attendees are able to participate in a way that feels most appropriate for them. So during this session, we encourage you to take mental breaks, move around, you can sit, stretch, grab a drink or snack. There are refreshments provided outside of the hall. You can turn your camera off. We do have Zoom attendees that are also attending this event as well, so you can turn your camera off, audio off, in the event as needed. Closed captions are available, and the chat is open for Digital Rhetorical Privacy Collective representative, Dr. Noah Weeson, will be able to respond to any needs or general questions about the DRPC. The Q&A feature is enabled for you to submit questions to the panel. Please save all questions until the end of the speaker's presentation. We are recording sessions for sharing for those who cannot attend or those who would like to follow up. If you would prefer to not have your face recorded, however, again, we encourage you to turn off your camera. We are so happy that you have invited and attended this event, Surveillance on the Sea. Okay, so the event today titled Surveillance on the Sea is one of 6 events during Data Privacy Week hosted by the Digital Rhetorical Privacy Collective. I'll refer to them as DRPC from here on out. We are a coalition of scholars from institutions across the United States, of which I am an advisory board member. The DRPC is an interactive coalitional resource which features activities, assignments, lesson plans, and other resources for instructors who wish to incorporate privacy and surveillance in the classroom. Our mission is to raise awareness of the injustices created by digital privacy and surveillance issues in society. This project emphasizes an intersectional approach to understanding and incorporating concepts like justice, privacy, and surveillance in the classroom. And while we are a group of rhetoric and writing studies scholars, the resources we produce can be adopted and adapted across disciplines. This community-driven project was founded in 2022 to bridge scholarly and public discussions about privacy and surveillance. Over the past year, the DRPC Advisory Board has collaborated to produce this Privacy Week, which is the primary outcome of our 2023 Conference on College Composition and Communication, aka 4Cs. This was an Emergent Researcher Award, and we want to thank 4Cs for believing in the potential of this project. and for providing us with funding and mentoring to make this event possible. Thank you also to UMass Maritime for sponsoring our speaker today. Importantly, DRPC Privacy Week occurs concurrently with Data Privacy Week, which, according to the Federal Privacy Council, is a global effort to raise awareness about the importance of respecting privacy, safeguarding data, and enabling trust. Data Privacy Week is not only an international effort to create awareness about digital data privacy, but also how data is being used and sometimes exploited by businesses, universities, organizations, and governments. This cause advocates for respecting the privacy of individuals and for institutions to be more transparent about how they handle user data. The goal of DRPC Privacy Week is to amplify topics about privacy and surveillance for rhetoric, composition, and technical communication scholars and our community partners. To that end, the advisory board has produced a week-long interinstitutional event with panel discussions, workshop opportunities, and student demonstrations, culminating in a keynote panel. This week includes 18 collaborators across 14 different institutions. And again, you can register for all of the events and access recordings at our drpcollective.com. We also have a Twitter, aka X, right? Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram, and are using hashtag DRPC Privacy Week 24 primarily. The objective of maritime surveillance is to holistically understand, anticipate, and administer all events and actions related to the maritime domain that could impact on areas of maritime security. Maritime surveillance can encompass everything from coastal surveillance to vessel traffic monitoring and people and environmental protection. Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Timothy Walker here on campus to discuss surveillance in the maritime industry. In particular, Dr. Walker will discuss the Maritime Underground Railroad, documenting methods the holding class used to keep enslaved people from achieving their freedom by sea. Dr. Timothy Walker is a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts Dartmouth, where he serves on the executive board of the Center for Portuguese Studies and Culture and as graduate faculty for the doctoral program in Luso-Afro-Brazilian Studies and Theory. He is an affiliated researcher of the Centro de Historia da Cão e da Leme, apologize if I butchered that, Tim, Universidade Nova de Lisboa, Portugal. Walker was a visiting professor at the Universidade Alberta and Lisbon and at Brown University. He is the recipient of a Fulbright Dissertation Fellowship to Portugal, a doctoral research fellowship from the Portuguese Camões Institute, and an NEH-funded American Institute for Indian Studies Professional Development Grant for postdoctoral work in Goa, India. Walker has also been named a fellow of the Portuguese Orient Foundation, the Luso-American Development Foundation, and the Calouste Gulbenkian Foundation. In 2018, Walker was appointed a guest investigator of the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, drawing historic climate data from archived whaling logbooks, Portuguese colonial, and other maritime documentation. Walker is a contributing faculty member of the Munson Institute of Maritime Studies and director of the NEH Landmarks in American History workshop series titled Sailing to Freedom, New Bedford and the Underground Railroad. He has taught maritime history aboard numerous traditionally rigged sailing vessels, including the schooners Ernestina Morrissey and Letty G. Howard, the brig Niagara, and the ship HMS Rose. In 2020, Walker was appointed by the governor of Massachusetts to serve on the schooner Ernestina Morrissey Advisory Board, where he is the chair of the Educational Programming Committee. A long list of accomplishments here. So please give me a round of applause and welcome Dr. Walker.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now you understand why I look so tired because of all the things that I'm doing. I'm really very happy to be here. It's a great opportunity, and to be here at the Massachusetts Maritime Academy. It's now the caretaker and the institution that's charged with carrying on the schooner Ernestina's life is really an honor. So thank you for inviting me. So what I want to do today is talk a little bit about a research project of mine, which is the Maritime Underground Railroad. And we think a lot about, I don't know where you grew up. I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Detroit, Michigan. I grew up in Ohio. And out there, we think about the Underground Railroad as a terrestrial phenomenon where people are escaping over land. But I moved to Massachusetts for graduate school a long time ago. And then I moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts to be a crew member on the Ernestina in the 90s. And I ended up coming back to take a job at UMass Dartmouth in 2004. And as part of that experience, working on large traditional Greek sailing vessels and working on maritime documentation in these important port cities, it began to become clear to me and others that there was a part of the Underground Railroad story that was not being told. And that's the part of the story about people escaping by water, which it turns out is a tremendously important part of the Underground Railroad story. Now, I want to begin with a bit of a warning and to alert you to the fact that the material that I'm going to be talking about is necessarily material that deals with very difficult subject matter in the United States, and the language of much of the documentation that I'm going to be sharing with you is language that includes, frankly, racist information. So I want you to be aware of that, but I'm also of the opinion that we need to confront these attitudes about race in the 19th century. So I'll be proceeding to share with you a lot of original documentation. I don't want to feedback from this mic, so maybe we can turn that off.
That mic is off.
It is.
Yeah, if we want to just move the clip up a little bit.
Move it up.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. All right. All right, so let's proceed. This is a map from the National Geographic Society, and it presents the way the Underground Railroad is often taught in the United States. If you think about the Underground Railroad, this is probably one of the ways that you've confronted it. But I want to push back a little bit about this map because I think it presents some information that is frankly in error. And I want to push back about some of the lessons that it's trying to teach us here. If we are to take this map at face value, we are to understand that people were escaping by land from very far in the deep south, from central Mississippi or Alabama, or north in East Georgia or the Carolinas, going up over land to find freedom in northern free states. But the problem with that is that the historical record doesn't match that experience. The historical record shows us that almost every single documented overland escape began just a few miles from a border with a free state in the north. In other words, it was tremendously impractical for enslaved people to escape long distances over land, for some of the reasons that we're going to be talking about, because of the level of surveillance and the level of vigilance that the slave-owning population of the South exercised on the lives and movements of people who were enslaved in the South. It was really hard for an enslaved person to travel long distances away from the place where they were owned as property to make it to a free state over land. However, and the map kind of nods to this a little bit, if you could manage as an enslaved person to get aboard a ship in a port in the deep south along the coastline, the eastern seaboard, get on board a ship, it was a relatively fast, relatively low effort means of escaping hundreds of miles northward using the Gulf Stream and using the speed of sailboats, not super fast, but relative to overland travel, very fast. And you can achieve freedom by ship, by sea, much more efficiently than you could do it over land. And so this is what I want to talk about. And one of the reasons we undertook this, it's not just the work that I've done, the book that I had up there a moment ago. This is a book that was published 2 years ago. It's not only my work, I was the editor, but there were 9 other very accomplished historians who contributed to this book to tell the story of the Maritime Underground Railroad, which very relatively few people know much about. So what I want to do with my talk today is first talk about the Maritime Underground Railroad and what was going on and how people were escaping by sea. And then talk about the tools that were available to the owner class, to the law enforcement forces of the South to try to stop people from escaping by water or overland for that matter. Well, there are a couple things that we need to think about from the beginning. One is that, first of all, in the late 18th and early 19th century, indeed right up until the 1850s, the middle of the 19th century, a very large proportion of the seagoing workforce was actually African American. Almost 20% of sailors working in the merchant marine of the United States were African Americans, a little bit less than 20. So almost 1 in 5, and that's a very large number relative to what most people think when they think about American mariners in the 19th century. So many of them, most of them, were free Black Americans who had the right to work on board ships and earn wages, but many of them were enslaved, paying their wages to the person who owned them for the work that they did on vessels. So we have both things going on. The other thing that's happening is that, and I think probably most of you know this, but in the 19th century, up and down the eastern seaboard, there are no railroads, there are no highways. And so almost all commercial traffic moved by water. If you want to move heavy bulk goods, cargo, you've got to do it by ships. And so there are hundreds, thousands of mid-sized vessels, schooners, sloops, brigs, moving up and down the East Coast constantly from the middle of the 1700s until almost the 20th century. Most of America's economy functioned with maritime labor and moving things by ship. So I put that image of Boston Harbor there to remind us of that. The other thing that's going on, if we were to drop ourselves into a port city of the South and look at the labor force that's there, it's almost entirely enslaved African American males. The labor force of the port cities of the South is mostly enslaved Black men. There are some whites, there are some free Blacks, there are some women, relatively few, but almost any port of the South, the labor being done there is being done by enslaved people. So when we think about slavery in the American context, in the US context, we typically think about plantation labor. But in fact, in the South, enslaved people were doing almost all of the work, and particularly in port cities. So what were they doing? They're doing work that is both very skilled and unskilled labor too. So what are they doing? They're waterfront dock and wharf workers. They're longshoremen. They're stevedores. They are warehousemen. They are drovers delivering cartloads of goods that are provisions and repair goods to and from the ships. They're doing everything on the waterfront. There are also very skilled laborers doing rigging, sail making, any of the highly complex and highly skilled labor necessary to keep ships afloat. If you think about stevedores and longshoremen, guys who load and unload ships, it's really important to know how to load and unload a ship properly, because a sailing vessel, if it isn't loaded right, the trim will be off and it won't sail properly. So this is skilled labor that these guys know how to do. They're also working at sea. They are fishermen. They are watermen. They are working as ferrymen. Lightermen. Lighters are ships that you use to load and unload a vessel that's at anchor or on a mooring. They are deckhands and they are pilots, although they couldn't adopt or use that title. They were prohibited from being called a pilot, but they have the skills necessary for piloting large craft. Much of this work is being done with great autonomy. They're not constantly under the eyes of an overseer. They are often commanding vessels, fishing vessels, ferry vessels. They are doing this work, but they are enslaved. All of this labor gives them an advantage. It gives them strategic knowledge of the sea, of the workings of harbors. They know, for example, when and where the forces of law enforcement arrive and make their rounds around the port. They are in an incredibly good position to know where the holes are that allow for escapes through the systems of ports. They know when ships are about to clear for harbor. They know the administrative acts that need to happen to clear a ship from harbor and how to avoid any law enforcement. So this is important strategic knowledge that African Americans are using to escape from enslavement by sea. Let's also look at a couple of maps to show where the enslaved population of the United States was centered in the years prior to the Civil War. And much of it is centered. The darkest areas on the map are where the highest populations of enslaved people are. And these are often 60, 70, 80, even 90% of the population in some of these regions are enslaved people. And they're all along the waterways and in the port cities. And again, this is because the only way to move heavy cargo, the way to move agricultural goods that are being grown on plantations, people have to load them on the boats to take them down to the harbors, to load the goods onto seagoing ships so that they can be taken to market. And all that work is being done by enslaved watermen. If we look just at South Carolina, you can see all of those coastal waterways. Where ferries, cargo boats, lighters, any kind of vessel to move heavy cargo have to navigate those very difficult waters that often have navigational hazards in them. The guys who know how to do that are the African American watermen. The South's economy relies on them. The South's economy would not function without them. And this helps us to explain why the South didn't replace those workers with free white or even free African American workers. They relied on the enslaved laborers for generations prior to the Civil War. Now, you should ask yourself, how do historians know that people were escaping by water? Remember, this is illegal activity, it's clandestine, it does not leave a paper trail. Generally, people are not usually advertising that they're about to escape. So as a historian, we have to suss this out, we have to tease out these facts in other ways. So there are several important ways that we know that this is going on. First of all, authorities are complaining about it. The governor of Virginia in the 1840s said, hey, we're losing $100,000 worth of human property a year out of the single port of Norfolk, Virginia. $100,000 worth of human property is literally hundreds of people. And that's in just 1 year. Might be a little bit less than hundreds, but it's a lot of people. And if you add it up over decades and the decades before the Civil War, we're talking about, hundreds of people a year escaping from just Virginia and people escaping from other states as well. So we know that's going on. The other way we know is from some of the documentation that's left behind. And one of the best sources of documentation that we have are runaway slave ads. And many, many, many of them, from even the 18th century, refer to people escaping by water in the advertisement. So the advertisement is an owner of a slave who is trying to get their property back. And they give a physical description of the person. They also usually give some kind of an indication about how they think their property has run away. Now, this is a very early runaway slave act, 1772. If you want to read it, notice that the S's are these elongated S's. So what it says here is, this is a guy named Phil, he's 5'9", he's about 20 years old. As he has been used to the sea, he will probably endeavor to get on board some ship and make his escape out of the colony. All masters of vessels are therefore forewarned from harboring or carrying him off at their peril. So this tells us a couple of things. One, that people are escaping. Second, that there are consequences for shipmasters who would help people to escape. This is already beginning to be written into law that ship crew members, ship captains cannot help people to escape or they're legally liable for that. There's another one. $10 reward absconded from the household of the President of the United States on Saturday. This is May 1796, Philadelphia. Who's the President of the United States? George Washington. This is an escaped slave from the household of George Washington. Her name was Only Judge. She's about 20 years old. And Washington's agent put this in the newspaper, Philadelphia, to say, as she may attempt to escape by water, all masters of vessels and others are cautioned against receiving her on board. In fact, Only Judge did escape by water. She got on the vessel, came down the river at Philadelphia, came out the Delaware Bay, and sailed northward, where she took up residence in New Hampshire. And George Washington spent the rest of his life, about another 3 years, trying to get her back, never successfully. She lived the rest of her life in freedom, and we know about this because she wrote about it when she was an older woman in the mid-19th century. Here's another one. This is 1810 Baltimore. This object is to go to sea and will be trying to ship on board some vessel bound out. Note below, all masters of vessels and others are forewarned harboring or taking off said Negro at their peril. So the legal system is developing to stop ship owners and ship masters from assisting maritime escapes. There are over 220,000 extant advertisements, individual advertisements in U.S. newspapers that are runaway slave ads. And an astonishingly high percentage of them include maritime escapes. Now, we've not looked at every single one of them, but we've surveyed them, and we know that this is happening in a much larger percentage of cases than we expect. I'll just step through a couple of other examples. This is from 1838. There's very little doubt can be entertained of his conveyance away on board some vessel. I will give further reward of $500 for the conviction and punishment agreeable to law of the master or captain, and half that sum for any of the crew or any other person engaged in this felonious act. So if we're going to start talking and thinking about surveillance, one thing to understand is that we are talking about relatively closed port cities with relatively small populations in which everybody more or less knew everybody else. When a new ship arrived with a crew from far away, those people were known and could be very easily observed by the local population. People working on the waterfront were all known to one another. These are closed, tight, small communities. The population of the U.S. is a fraction of what it is today. And so, because of that, surveillance was relatively easy in terms of people who worked in the port, who were known in the port, knowing strangers who were not meant to be normally on the waterfront. It made it much more difficult for people to come, enslaved people, to come into the port and then get aboard ship and leave. But if an enslaved person is already working in the port, it's relatively easy for them to get aboard a vessel if they can hide themselves, sometimes with the cooperation of the northern crew, sometimes not. Sometimes they would literally stow away and be secretive about their escape. Other times they were helped by northern crew members who didn't agree with the idea of enslavement and wanted to help people to escape. Both things happened. Another example. Here's two people, Mary, and she's 26 to 30 years old, but she has a companion, William. Both of them have had for a long time relations with the Negro fishermen of the bayou. So there's a suspicion on the part of the Southern slaveholder class that fishermen and other black watermen are helping enslaved people to escape. Again, the idea is that Strategic knowledge comes from waterfront and waterborne labor. And these folks who are working in the waterborne trades, the maritime trades, are helping people to escape. So here's another kind of advertisement. It's not a runaway slave ad. In fact, it's just the opposite. You may have heard of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which shut down and made it a federal crime to escape and to help someone to escape into the North. But there's an earlier Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. And that Fugitive Slave Act created laws, specific a federal law, against helping someone to escape by water. But a captain, if he was charged with this, or if he was accused of helping someone to escape, had a plausible deniability loophole. And that meant that he had to say that he didn't know anything about what had happened on his vessel, that it wasn't his intention to help. You're only liable for the crime if you intended in a premeditated way to help someone. But if the captain says, I didn't know anything about it, then the captain had a legal defense against being prosecuted. And that's what's going on in this advertisement. This is from a New Bedford newspaper, William Taber, the same family as Taber Academy, 1797. And this is Captain Taber's public notice saying, hey, this guy escaped on my vessel, but I didn't have anything to do with it. To all whom it may concern, know ye that I, William Taber, commander of the sloop Union, sailed from York River in Virginia on or about the 28th of March last, bound to this port, New Bedford. But on the day after sailing, I discovered a Negro on board said sloop who had concealed himself unbeknownst to me. I knew nothing about it. And here's where it really gets interesting. It appearing inconsistent for me to return and return the property, the wind being ahead, I proceeded on my voyage and landed him in this port, New Bedford. So what he's saying is, I'm on a sailing ship, I don't have an engine, the wind was behind me, I couldn't turn around and take it back, I haven't taken with me to New Bedford. Sorry, that's, I just had to go on my voyage. I am not liable, I'm not responsible. He calls his name James. Is that really his name? We don't know. Could be anybody. He calls his son James, he's 27 years old, and says he belongs to Mr. Shackelford, a planter in Kings and Queens County, Virginia. To any person claiming him will know by this information where he is, for which purpose it is made public in this manner, and every legal method has been taken to prevent the owner losing his property in my power. Here's a newspaper published in Massachusetts in 1797. Eventually, probably, Mr. Shackelford will know about this because newspapers circulated up and down the coast. But this is a weekly publication. By the time the owner gets news, or by the time any federal authority gets news, James, fugitive, could be anywhere. But this legal notice has provided coverage, legal coverage, to the captain so that he can't be prosecuted. And the penalties were pretty extreme. The captain could lose his vessel, the captain could be fined, the captain could have his livelihood threatened because he wouldn't be able to do business in the port anymore where he had taken off someone who was an enslaved person. So the law had teeth, but there were ways to avoid the law. All of this gives us an insight into the tools that the slave owning class had to keep their property from running away. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Now let's start talking about surveillance. Let's start talking about the tools at the disposal of the slave owning class to keep their property enslaved. One of the first ones, of course, is the United States Coast Guard, then known as the Revenue Service. We have revenue cutters such as these two, the Massachusetts and the Eagle, which functioned in the 1790s, early 1800s. They were empowered to stop vessels that were considered potential means of transport for enslaved people. But something else we have to keep in mind, throughout the entire 19th century, territorial waters where sovereign law could be exercised is only 3 miles, 3 nautical miles. And so, once a ship clears the harbor and gets 3 miles off shore, for a sailing vessel, that's a matter of an hour in good weather, maybe a little more. They are outside the zone where they can be stopped and searched legally by U.S. Customs Service. So these maps are modern maps, and they show much longer territorial waters. Nowadays, what's it, 200 nautical miles, something like that offshore? That first little margin there is 3 miles. And there's 12 nautical miles, 24 nautical miles, and so on. The U.S. Customs Service at the time had 3 nautical miles. And if you're outside that, sailing in the Gulf Stream up the East Coast, you're a northern vessel and you're carrying an enslaved person, you can't be stopped and searched. There are no choke points, there are no bottlenecks, there are no places where law enforcement can happen. And that's one of the reasons why escaping by water was so much better from the point of view of the enslaved person than escaping by land. Because on land, you're going to confront all kinds of impediments to your freedom. You're going to encounter all kinds of moments where you can be stopped and challenged and returned to enslavement. That does not happen on the water. Here's a case. This is 1849. A guy called Thomas Jones, who had worked for a long time as a longshoreman in Wilmington, North Carolina. He managed to get on a brig called the Bell in 1849, and he stowed away. The captain didn't know he was there. And when the captain discovered him, the captain determined to turn him over to federal authorities once they got to New York. So he gets to New York Harbor, the captain goes on shore to find a federal marshal. And Thomas Jones sees his opportunity. He very quickly assembled some boards into a raft, probably not nearly as nice as depicted here. And he tries to make his escape. They were anchored 2 miles offshore. The mate and some of the crews chased him, but he gets picked up by 2 abolitionists in a boat and secreted away into a safe house and an underground railroad house in New York City. So he makes his escape. He makes it first to New Bedford and then to Boston. And eventually, he writes a book about it called The Experience of Thomas Jones, who was a slave for 40 years, published in 1862, as soon as the Civil War. Of the 107, more or less, runaway slave narratives that we have, these are enslaved people who managed to escape and then wrote books about it. 70% of them mention escape by water. Now that tells us a couple of things. Maritime workers tend to have a better chance of being literate than people who worked in other jobs as enslaved people. But it's extraordinary that a high percentage of runaway slave narratives are typically watermen, sailors, people who worked in ports. They have the opportunities to learn how to read and to write. So here's a typical port. This is New Orleans, middle of the 19th century, waterfront work. We looked at almost everyone in the image as a person of color. It's relatively easy to keep a surveillance view of what's going on in this harbor. If anyone is there who's not supposed to be there, the owner class would know about it, overseers would know about it. But let's look at some of the people and some of the tools of surveillance that existed in harbors in the 18th and 19th centuries, 1700s. Watchmen, hired, charged. This is before there were commonly police forces in the United States or in other parts. Some of these images are actually English, but you get the idea. But notice that they have a couple of things. They typically have a lantern. They have some kind of a noisemaker, which is our word called makes a noise to sound the alarm if anything is amiss. And they have a weapon, not a firearm, a cudgel, something to whack someone with, a shillelagh if you're thinking about Irish vocabulary. A cudgel which can be used to enforce the law. So these guys would wander around ports in the evening, making sure that people were not clandestinely getting on and off ships, mostly to make sure that smuggling wasn't happening, smuggling any kind. And in this case, for our purposes, we're talking about humans. So this exists, and this is probably the first line of defense when we think about surveillance in ports. We have records of these guys being paid. Here's a pay slip from Newburyport, Massachusetts, 1797. Southern ports would have the same thing. Another thing to think about is how could information be quickly transmitted up and down the coast? And there weren't very many tools. The fastest way that information tended to move was on the boats themselves. But there were a few places that had systems of telegraphic transmission of information, often from ship to shore. I included these only to say that there are just a few places in the United States, and this is actually one of them. So there's a system in Massachusetts that ran between Boston and Cape Cod. You can see little triangles where all the telegraph stations were, and they could move a message in about 10 to 15 minutes from along the coast. Again, there's no radio, there's no telephone, there's no means to move information very quickly. But if there were ships where you thought someone had been hidden away aboard a ship, and you could catch them before they got out of that 3-mile zone, this would be one of the ways that you could transmit information quickly. Another way that we know, that historians know, that this was going on is because southern states started to pass laws trying to control the movements of African American sailors. The owner class was horribly worried that the people who were encouraging enslaved people to escape were these free Black mariners working in large numbers aboard northern ships. And so, the southern states, the slaveholding states, beginning in 1822 with South Carolina, or Charleston, started to pass laws on the books to restrict the movements of African American free Black sailors. So it happens first in Georgia in 1820. First in South Carolina, then Georgia, North Carolina, Florida, and these various other states. And what did these laws do? It meant that if a captain came into port with a free Black sailor, that sailor either was restricted to the ship during the entire time that the ship was in port, which could be weeks in some cases, or they would be incarcerated on land. They were held in a jail at the expense of the vessel. The captain had to pay for the care and maintenance of the person being held in a prison on land. And we have, in all the major ports of the South, jail facilities built specifically to hold free Black mariners who come into port. We have several images from the time of the Civil War. Another thing that can be done is that southern states, southern ports started to pass both city ordinances and state laws that gave them the power to search vessels before they left. And they started setting up special offices and special facilities to search vessels before they would leave harbor to make sure that there weren't any enslaved people on board. So we have people searching for stowaways. We have stories from the Underground Railroad of ships being searched. This is a famous story of a captain whose name was James Watson Fountain. His schooner was called the City of Richmond. It was a packet schooner that went on a regular predetermined route up and down the coast. He was secretly helping people to escape. And in this particular instance, there's a delegation from the city of Norfolk that comes aboard his schooner, and they say, "Hey, we think you're harboring enslaved people." He says he's outraged. He says, "No, I'm not doing this." He grabs an axe and he starts to hack into his own vessel to say, "I'll show you that there's no one here." And they're so impressed, they say, "Okay, well, we believe you and we'll leave." He had 21 people on board. He had 21 people on board who he then took to Philadelphia, and they achieved freedom in this particular case. Another thing that southern states started to do in ports was they would fumigate vessels using really noxious fumes to go below the vessel and fumigate with vinegar and with brimstone, sulfur, and try to drive out anyone who might be secreted below deck. So this is a tool of, I'm not sure if this falls in the camp of surveillance, but it's the forces of surveillance that are using this as a way to drive people out of ships so that they won't escape. We have, numerous examples of that. Also in the newspapers, we find images of people being discovered working on ships after they had got away. Here's a ship that went into harbor in Savannah, Georgia. An escaped person was on board working as the cook, and that person had been enslaved in Savannah, and as soon as they got into harbor, someone recognized them. Probably the cook, who had absolutely no right to say to the captain, hey, you can't go into this harbor because, I'm still legally property there. The cook probably tried to keep a low profile, but someone recognized him. This gives us a sense of just how dangerous it was for an enslaved person who had escaped to go back to the harbor where they had worked previously. Because chances are they would. This is another example, someone attempting to escape from a northbound schooner, and they were recognized and stopped because if you read the story, people noticed that there was some suspicious activity going on in the schooner. They thought it might be carrying people. When it abruptly raised its anchor and started to go down the river, the Appomattox River, it was stopped, searched, and they found these people. Other forces of surveillance included slave patrols that were created specifically to stop people from running away. And we have numerous examples of identification for these slave patrols in the South. And again, a warning that some of the images and some of the language that's being used here is going to be quite offensive. There were people advertising that had specially trained dogs to track down and capture people who were trying to escape from enslavement. There's an advertisement right on the eve of the Civil War. And lots of images show the use of trained dogs by the slave patrols to track down and hunt people who were enslaved trying to make their freedom. The slave patrols were empowered to stop people, check their papers, check their permissions to be abroad, moving around at night or in odd hours of the day. And again, this is one of the ways that the enslaved population of the U.S. South, and by the way, anywhere else in the Americas where slavery was a thing, Cuba, Brazil, Haiti, slavery was happening everywhere. But one of the ways that the population is controlled is that they could only move about with permission from their owner. And so, the slave patrols are empowered to stop and check people's papers, or check their some sort of evidence that they have the right to move around. Here's a written pass for an enslaved person, written in 1849 against Charleston, South Carolina. Grace has my permission to sleep Sunday, Saturday for 3 months from this date, and it gives a date. So the enslaved person had the right to be somewhere else. Other methods included giving tags to enslaved people. And if you look closely, these tags say what the person's job was. This one over here says mechanic. This one over here says porter. Some of them say servant. But a person with such a tag might have a legitimate reason for being on business of the owner somewhere at night, and so they might be allowed to carry on with their work. But imagine that if you were escaping overland, far from where you were held as an enslaved person, if you didn't have proper ID or a proper excuse, a permission, then you would be immediately swept up by these slave patrols, and you'd be taken back, identified by your number and your tag, to the person who owned you and who controlled your life and your labor. This is why escaping over land was so difficult, and why escaping by water was relatively more efficient and safer for the enslaved person. Another piece of this puzzle are seamen's protection papers. Free black sailors had the right to work anywhere in the United States. And so they were given a seamen's protection paper that identified them as a free person of color. And it's exactly this kind of document. They were issued by the port authorities up and down the East Coast. They were meant to be respected as evidence of the person's free status. It didn't prohibit Southern states from incarcerating them while they were in port on their ships, but it did keep them from, theoretically, being re-enslaved, although that was always a danger. Famously, Frederick Douglass used exactly that kind of document to escape from Maryland. Carrying a seaman's paper, he dressed himself as a sailor because it was perfectly plausible and perfectly normal that an African-American man carrying such a paper would be allowed to travel up and down the East Coast without impediment, without arrest. In fact, he looked the part so much that he was never challenged. He had to borrow it. It was a borrowed seaman's protection paper. And he comes to New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is his first home in freedom. If you ever make it to New Bedford and want to know about the maritime history of the place, Frederick Douglass is a big part of that. He and his family lived in New Bedford for a number of years, and two of his sons served in the famous all-black 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry during the Civil War. Why did people come to New Bedford? I'm drawing to a close soon, but New Bedford was a place that was known as the fugitive Gibraltar, a place where enslaved people could find freedom. In part because it was a thriving whaling port in the 19th century. So the same jobs that enslaved African Americans who escaped knew how to do from having worked on waterfront ships, they could get work immediately in New Bedford for wages that they earned themselves legitimately. And if they were trying to avoid re-enslavement, they could sign aboard a whaling voyage, be in the Pacific or the Indian Ocean, the South Atlantic for years at a time. The average whaling voyage was 2 to 3 years. And by the time they came back, they would have earned a bit of money, and probably the effort to re-enslave them, to recapture them, would have died down. So this is one of the reasons why New Bedford becomes the terminus point for the Underground Railroad, for people seeking freedom. They could work in the maritime trades, and they could be protected. Another thing about the whaling industry is that it's in the hands of Quakers who are abolitionists. They are philosophically opposed to slavery. So the entire town of New Bedford had a reputation for being a safe haven, literally, for enslaved people. And the town prided itself, the abolitionists of New Bedford prided themselves for being a place where no one was ever taken back into slavery. New York could not say that, Boston could not say that, Providence, Rhode Island could not say that, but New Bedford was a place where no one was enslaved after having been enslaved. South. Here's a poster from Boston, 1851, warning the people of color in Boston to be on the lookout because there were known bounty hunters in town looking to identify former slaves who were still legally property. Another example of surveillance. Another example of the tools that were available to the owner class to try to get their property back. Bounty hunters who made their living recapturing people who had run away. Again, the port, this is a Bedford State Pier, where now you can catch a ferry to Martha's Vineyard or Nantucket. Back in the day, at the peak of the whaling days, it was chock-a-block with large barrels of oil and provisions, and this provided the labor that people who had escaped enslavement counted on. They could always get jobs in Bedford. Finally, a few examples of people who tried to help and who benefited from running away from water. Daniel Drayton, who is buried in Bedford, his grave is there. He was a schooner captain who tried to escape from Washington, D.C. with 77 enslaved people on board a schooner called the Pearl. It's the largest known attempted escape by water, the largest known attempted escape of enslavement in U.S. history happens in 1849. And what he writes in his memoir is that this is happening all the time. Captain of a northern vessel, when they come to anchor, they are surrounded by people begging them to take them northward. And it was common. It was so common that he notes that it just simply happened all the time. In this particular incident, they boarded the vessel up in Washington, D.C. They came down the Potomac. They got to the mouth of the Potomac River. It's a sailing vessel, and the wind was against them, so they were stuck. They had to wait. And during that time, a posse was mounted in Washington, D.C. aboard a steamship, a steam vessel, and they came down and recaptured them. It didn't help that some of the people on board, the enslaved people, were the property of some of the most powerful people in Washington, D.C., members of the government, members of some of the government agencies in Washington, and they very quickly got an armed posse together and put them on a steam vessel and recaptured the schooner. Many of those people were then sold to the Deep South as punishment for having dared to try to run away. This is a notice by the mayor of Washington to talk about the events of this escape, which really upset the city. But it also, at the time, slavery was legal in Washington, D.C. And so this began a movement to try to make slaveholding within the nation's capital illegal, because it was an embarrassment to have representatives from European countries that had abolished slavery coming to Washington, D.C. in the 1840s and 1850s, when most of the rest of the world had outlawed slavery, and here it was happening right in the streets of the nation's capital. The slave people, who, by the way, built the White House and the Capitol. Many of the main buildings of the United States were actually built with slave labor, something that isn't often advertised in the United States. A couple of other examples. This is Elizabeth Blakely. She escaped by sea in 1850. She was only 15 years old. Most people escape by sea are men, so she's a bit of a rarity. But one of the things that escape by sea allowed was for, and this is again why escaping over land was difficult, escaping by water meant that you could take older people, very young children, women. So Elizabeth Blakely's 15. She was 2 weeks at sea. She suffered horrible frostbite, but she lived the rest of her life in freedom. And her story wasn't published until the 1920s, when she was quite an old woman. Another thing that's going on in Boston is that abolitionists, people who wanted to eliminate slavery up in Boston, worked out ways to get people off of ships safely and into safe houses, and then to get them away from Boston, where they were less likely to be recaptured. In the 1850s, a yacht called Moby Dick would go out at night and quietly take people off, ostensibly bringing supplies and treats and things for the sailors, but what they were really doing is looking for contraband people who they would then get into safe houses in the Underground Railroad. This is one of my favorite illustrations of the Maritime Underground Railroad. This is a schooner that has come to a relatively little known place in Philadelphia Harbor, League Island. And in the middle of the night, the full moon in the background, we see them taking off entire families of enslaved people, putting them into carriages where the windows had been covered so people prying eyes could not see inside, and then they would take them to safe housing. This is in a book by William Still called The Underground Railroad, A Record of Facts, Authentic Letters and Narratives. William Still was an African-American man who was a operative of the Underground Railroad. He had a safe house very close to the port in Philadelphia. And he did something that was very unwise, probably a little bit foolhardy, but he kept a diary of all the people who helped. And that diary records almost 700 people helped to escape in the 1850s. He was never discovered. He later publishes the diary in 1872, and this is how we know a lot about the Underground Railroad, especially Maritime. Because William Still publishes this extraordinary book. But we can see here that many of the abolitionists, there are white guys, but there's also a lot of people of color who are working with the abolitionists, trying to get people to freedom. I'll finish with just a couple of local stories. This is a guy who probably none of you have heard of. He was a local sea captain after the Civil War. His name is Nipsey Hill. His obituary appeared in the Bedford newspapers and the Boston Globe in the 1890s with Dimes. But in the fall of thing, he stole charts that he knew would be useful to the blockading U.S. Navy at the beginning of the Civil War. And he hid them in a cemetery, and then he collected 4 of his waterman friends, and they stole a pilot boat, and they sailed out to the blockading Union ships, and, raised a white flag, and they turned over the sea charts to the Union Navy, and then they signed on as able seamen and served throughout the war. Afterwards, he settles in Buzzards Bay. He operated a very popular fishing and excursion boat in the 1880s and 1890s, and he was so well regarded that he passed away. He gets a pretty sizable obituary in the Boston Globe, which was unheard of for an African American at the time. So we get a sense of just how valued this guy was. He's a local fellow. My final example is this one, Robert Smalls, who this is a story that needs to be a movie. I think there are several attempts right now to make this into a film. It's so incredible. The planter had been a cargo vessel carrying cotton in Charleston Harbor, but at the beginning of the Civil War, it's converted to a gunboat with a cannon and armor. Its crew was entirely enslaved black men. There were 3 white officers. And one evening, the white officers went to shore for a party, and the black crew, led by Robert Smalls, said, "This is our chance." They alerted their families. They said, "Meet us on the neighboring wharf." So they stole the vessel, picked up their families, and then they had to navigate the surveillance of the harbor in order to get safely out of it without being fired on by the fortresses that were guarding Charleston Harbor, of which there were several. So they left Charleston, there's a battery there, there's Fort Sumter, there's several other batteries around Fort Johnson, and they had to navigate through the channels to get out. Smalls, who was a pilot, and was the guy who normally piloted the vessel, he took the captain's coat and hat and put it on. It's the middle of the night, so there's not a lot of light, but he knew the signals. He knew the signals, the proper signals to give to the force so that they wouldn't be fired on. They sail out of the harbor, they go to the blockading Union vessels, and his wife had the forethought to bring a big sheet, a white sheet, to show that they were not actually a hostile gunboat. And they turned the boat over to the Union Navy. Smalls becomes the first black man, the first African-American man to command a U.S. naval vessel. He commands the planter that he had helped to steal. And then after the war, he rises to prominence. He's one of the first African-American men elected to Congress during Reconstruction. He buys the home of his enslaver in Charleston and moves into it. He takes care of his enslaver's wife when the enslaver dies and she's sickly. And he serves multiple terms in Congress. And if that isn't justice, I don't know what is. It's a fantastic story. So I'll leave you with that and say thank you for your attention. And I very much enjoyed sharing this information. I'm happy to have questions.
Alrighty, so, up here, get our mic back again. Is there anybody that has a question for Dr. Walker? We can start maybe with anybody in person, while those of you ruminating online, a virtual audience as well. Any questions for Dr.
I'm very user friendly, so please ask me questions. I'm happy to have them. And you know what's exciting for me about giving talks like this is that you guys see stuff that I know, and you might alert me to things that I missed, which is an important part of my job is to think about this in different ways. Yeah, this question.
Okay, wonderful. I'll pass it to you.
That, what happened to the captains, once they found this thing? They fined, were they arrested, were they put in jail, were the ship confiscated?
So that's a great question. The question is, what happened to the captains? So in most cases, again, this is clandestine illegal activity in which they didn't advertise that they were actually helping people to escape. And so often they just pretended like nothing had happened. No one was the wiser. And so in most cases, captains who assisted with successful escapes were not prosecuted, and it didn't become known until after the Civil War had begun. In those cases where they're caught, and some of them are caught, they tend to be prosecuted to the extent of the law. And so what they risk in the South is being fined by municipalities, having their cargoes and their vessels confiscated, being banned from doing business in those harbors. In some cases, they were in prison. So, for example, Daniel Drayton, who I mentioned, who was caught on the schooner Pearl, he serves 4 years in federal prison. He's a broken man. His fortune is lost, and he ends up. It's a very sad story. He comes back to New Bedford to meet with some of the abolitionists who we had worked with, who had helped him to plan this escape attempt. And he ends up taking his life in New Bedford. And he is interred there. The abolitionists of New Bedford created a very fine tomb for him, which you can visit. There's a photo of it in the book. But yeah, I mean, he's perhaps an extreme example, but many of these guys who were caught served prison time or at least suffered great fines for having done this. The law allowed. Other questions?
I have a couple over here.
Can you elaborate a little more on the connection between slaves working in maritime industries and literacy? You said there was
Yeah.
a similar-
So the link between people working in maritime trades and literacy. So there are a number of factors here, and it's a little fuzzy, but I'll share what I can. Working in the maritime trades often meant that you were working with greater autonomy. You're not being watched all the time by an overseer. And it was just the nature of being a crew member or a vessel commander. You happen to be enslaved. But if you're out fishing or doing oystering or working on a ferry boat, you have a lot more autonomy. And what often happened practically is that enslaved people would make a deal with their owners and say, look, I'm going to go off and work in the port. I'll give you my wages 2 or 3 times a year. And if I do any side work on my own account, I get to keep that. And from the point of view of the owners, that was great. They didn't, it was a assured income. For the owners, the risk they took is that their enslaved person might run away. And so the owners tried to do things all the time to keep their people from running away. And they would, well, I'm getting off track a little bit. that autonomy gave them opportunities to learn how to read. And sailors, in general, in the early 19th century, tended to be white sailors tended to be a pretty literate group of people. And so what you see is people who were enslaved learning the basics of reading and writing. And then once they escape, they often really take the opportunity to learn more. Frederick Douglass is a bit unusual because he actually learned to read and write before he escaped. That was kind of unusual. But in the case of some of the people that we're looking at, they really come into their own as readers and writers after they've achieved freedom, and they learn on whaling vessels where impromptu classes, some of the other crew members are teaching them how to read and write, officers are teaching them how to read and write. And living in northern port cities, they had opportunities to do that too. So there's a really active Black abolitionist group in Boston living on the north side of Beacon Hill. And they operate schools for people who have escaped and for African American children in Boston in the 19th century. So there are opportunities there to do that. Port towns gave them those opportunities that people working even just a few miles inland would not have had. So to contrast, people working on plantations in land-bound labor of any kind, if they're not working on waterfront, they don't have the same kinds of strategic knowledge that waterfront and maritime workers would have to escape or to learn to read and write.
Yeah, we'll go to our next question.
How much effort did the Revenue Service actually put into recovery? How successful were they?
Yeah, I think it was a relatively minor part of what they were set out to do. Their main jobs was to stop smuggling of goods, but the argument that I'm making is that in fact they had very little opportunity to interdict enslavement because the vessels that might be carrying fugitives were offshore within a couple of hours. They might have stopped people coming into port in the north. They might have stopped people just as they were leaving if there was suspicion. But that, again, because this is clandestine activity, anyone who's doing this is doing everything they can not to arouse suspicion. They want to slip through the forces of vigilance, the forces of surveillance, the forces of law enforcement if they can, and they're not making a big deal about it at all. There's a famous story, this is a bit off track at all, I think it illustrates what we're talking about. Frederick Douglass, once he becomes an established abolitionist in the North, there's a story of a guy called William Box Brown who had himself packed in a box and shipped northward. It took about 27 hours or something, and he almost died because he was put upside down on his head. But anyway, he successfully escaped by being shipped by the Postal Service. And then he went around the country giving talks about how he had done this. And he was making a living, becoming a celebrity by talking about his escape. Frederick Douglass was furious with him because he said, look, you're ruining it for anybody else who would try to do this. Because now the authorities are going to be on the lookout for people shipping themselves in boxes. And so to the extent that they could, the abolitionist community prior to the Civil War was doing everything they could to not make a big deal about this, and certainly not publicize ways that you could escape. That said, the Southern owner class was absolutely aware that large numbers of people were escaping by water. They knew that their ports were like a sieve of people escaping every year, but trying to find them and stop this, they did a cost benefits analysis and they said, okay, do we want to change our entire labor force in the southern harbors, or are we going to accept the losses of, a few hundred slaves a year? And it made more sense for them to accept the losses of the Customs Service. I have very, very few examples of the Customs Service having any impact at all.
Question for here as well. Check the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm awestruck. It was a wonderful presentation. Looking at notes, fantastic. I remember, and I have a faulty memory, but I remember in the 1980s there was a lot of scholarship about the profitability of using slaves in the production of cotton in the South. I think
The
that's
profitability of
using slaves to produce cotton and stuff. And I wonder if there's any connection between that and the drifting toward using slaves on the waterfront. Is there any sense of any of that?
So two things to think about that. I see your point. There was some expectation at the time of the passage of the Constitution, but the Constitution was ratified, of course. There is a provision of the Constitution that says the importation of enslaved people will be stopped 20 years after ratification. So it's actually illegal to import new enslaved people after 1808, which is 20 years after 1788, when the Constitution was ratified. That did not outlaw slavery, but it did outlaw the importation of new enslaved. So there was an expectation that slavery would gradually die out. The framework stopped. Two things happened. Cotton got super valuable produce. So there's more and more and more enslaved labor that's needed to work in the cotton fields of the South. And so much of the enslaved population in the northern states, in Kentucky and Virginia, it is gradually shipped south in an internal slave trade after 1808. And so you have about almost 2 million people who are shipped southward during the 19th century work in the cotton fields. That's separate from the labor force that's working in the harbors, because in order to get that plantation, all of the produce of the plantations being produced, to get that to market and to make that economically viable, you need a workforce that can move it by water down the inland waterways to the major ports, to put them on ocean-going vessels so they can be shipped out to markets. Both labor forces are absolutely essential. Both labor forces are key to the Southern economy, and indeed to the entire US economy, and both labor forces in the South are enslaved. So I don't think there was any reduction or any change because both labor forces were absolutely essential. One other point I wanted to make. So maybe it'll come back. Yeah, it's a great question.
Hi, thank you. My question is just, did you come across any examples of enslaved people actually having the documentation either seized or destroyed when they were, traveling either by land or over by sea?
Yeah. So what we see, I see your question, and I see it's a very good question, and your point is a very good one too. What tended to happen, and the great danger, the great vulnerability of free black is that they could be identified as former slaves and then re-enslaved. So, what often happens, so there's a wonderful film that came out a couple of years ago called 12 Years a Slave, and it was about a guy who was a legitimately free African-American guy working in New York. He's a musician, I think. He comes down to play a gig near New York City, and he's identified by a bounty hunter who knows he's free, but makes the argument that he's actually property and benefits to the tune of hundreds of dollars by taking this guy back. So there's an incentive for unscrupulous people to use the system to enslave people who had never been slaves, or to identify people who had escaped, who are still legally property, to take them back. And all of this is made possible and facilitated by the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which makes it a federal crime to assist someone who has achieved freedom at the North, to keep them in freedom. So to answer your question, yes, it happens a lot, but it's usually people who are either free or have papers identifying themselves as free, and those papers, those legal documents are disregarded.
I think that we will wrap up, and one final question to tie it all together, bring it back home, is thinking through some of the historical implications that you've talked about to modern day. Are you noticing any examples or themes of what you've talked about thus far, manifesting in current maritime surveillance?
Yeah, so the tools available for maritime surveillance today are just head and shoulders above what was available, you know. They never dreamed of closed circuit television, they never dreamed of identification that has embedded chips and, you know, related those. But I think that we're seeing, technology used in ways that, that do limit our mobility and our freedom. I mean, yes, they help us with law enforcement, and that's important, but the risk is where you strike that balance between freedom and legitimate needs of security in a modern state. And I think that's something that the law is constantly negotiating, and lawmakers and legal defenders, like civil rights, liberties, they're always in this tension-filled relationship of trying to navigate, to use a maritime term, to navigate that path. So, you know, it requires people to step up in defense of their own freedoms to stop that from that technological capacity being used, or used in ways that aren't sort of legitimate. I think since September 11th, 2001, we've all become a bit more comfortable with using the technology available to us to try to keep us safer. But we also need to be mindful of what we lost by making that bargain.
Well, I want to thank all of you again for attending Surveillance on the Sea, and those of you virtually as well. A recording will be available in the coming weeks, especially if you register for the event, which you can continue to do with the QR codes around this space as well. Thank you all again, and please give a round of applause to Dr. Walker.
Thank you for those of you who stayed. I know that some of you are really only meeting with their own classes and things, but I'm